With a market that is as saturated as the gaming industry, every company out there is doing their best to compete for both your time and your money. And while most fans of this hobby veer towards games of the AAA variety, every so often a game will come out that bridges the gap between what we consider an indie title versus games with enormous blockbuster budgets. But with a beautiful artistic vision and mostly intriguing story, Banishers Ghosts of New Eden seems to feel unique and handles the pressures of gaming narrative quite well, almost better than what most legacy studios can offer. However, things begin to fall apart once you add in combat, level design, and other basic gameplay elements into the equation, as then the player is reminded that this is in fact a AA game. But the real question here is, are the negative gameplay mechanics bad enough to prevent you from spending your hard-earned money on it? While the answer isn't as clear-cut as I would like it to be, it should be noted that Banishers Ghosts of New Eden becomes exponentially better the more time you sink into it. And with even more video games entering into our never-ending backlogs, spending 10 hours waiting for a game to finally open up may not be worth the upfront $50 price tag, especially when that game is roughly 25 hours long. After finally landing in the northeast area of the United States, Antea and Red, our main protagonists, are off on an adventure to help rid the town of New Eden of an evil spirit which resides over the community. Red and Antea are known as Banishers, which help to banish evil spirits, ghosts, or other elements of the afterlife so that they can rest and bring peace to the living. Being a Banisher requires strict adherence to these rules, as the separation between the dead and the living is important, or else bad things can happen to all parties involved, not to mention people can't properly grieve. However, things take quite a turn for our main characters, as shortly after they arrive, Antea and Red encounter the Nightmare in the local church and decide to confront it. During this tutorial battle, the Nightmare kills Antea and she turns into a ghost herself. For the remainder of the game, Red is tasked with bringing her back to her body so that she can either resurrect from the dead or ascend peacefully to the afterlife. But the choice is up to you, the player, on how you want to proceed. This is a really awesome premise, and combined with the fact that the game takes place in the late 17th century, there are a ton of amazing tie-ins to witches and other aspects of early colonial life here in the United States. That being said, and I haven't really seen that many people talk about this, but there are a ton of modern progressive ideological framings in this game, and it's completely counterfactual to the history of this time period, as well as degrading to specific groups of people. So if that's something that you don't care to deal with, I totally understand, but it should be brought up, and we will be touching upon it at the end of the video. At first glance, the artistic direction for Ghosts of New Eden looks pretty damn great, and that's because it is. Dense foliage, sprawling vistas, and snowy mountain peaks are commonplace for you to spend time in. And without spoiling too much, there are many other interesting areas to explore as well that take much more of a fantastical approach to this era, which I am definitely a huge fan of. I played this game on my desktop, which has a 3080 Ti, and the game was pretty stable. I was getting around 70 FPS at 4K, and for reference, when I play Modern Warfare 3 on PC, I can get around 100 to 115 FPS at 4K using this same setup, but it was mostly stable and there were very few issues that I came across other than some frame drops during the loading of a major new area. There were no crashes, no corrupt saves, no glitched out missions, it just worked, which is all I can really ask for when it comes to a video game these days. I will say that when it comes to some of the actual graphical fidelity of some of the characters, as well as with some of their facial animations, that is when you'll kind of see that AA work come out in full force. It's quite observable during cutscenes that animations don't look quite right, whether it's just mouths moving or eyes staring off ever so slightly. It just doesn't have that same level of AAA polish that you'd find in even a game like Suicide Squad. But again, this isn't a knock or anything. It shouldn't deter you from enjoying your experience. It's just something that should be noted that, things are good, but they could always be a little bit better. However, gameplay is a completely different story, as this is hands down the most controversial aspect of the game by far. If you look up any comments, reviews, or Reddit threads, you will see that everyone and anyone is talking about is how awful the combat feels. But the issue is, it isn't just the combat that is suboptimal in the beginning, it's also the tools in your toolkit for exploration that are inept as well. Things do begin to change for the better the further you get into the game, but that's not necessarily fair to you. So while I would largely agree with people's intuition that things are off for about, 10 or so hours hours in, as you start to acquire more abilities, the game really does begin to open up across the board and becomes so much better to play. It's almost a night and day difference. But like I said, that's not really fair to the consumer, as you are paying for a video game to be fun from the very start. It's a developer's job to establish an amazing core gameplay loop from the get-go. It's not up to the customer to suffer through mediocrity in order to experience what might be fun eventually. And I think most people who tried this game, they played it for about 3 to 4 hours and thought, wow, this is actual crap. And then they returned it before it ever began to improve. And guess what? They were right to do that. But what is making the gameplay feel so bad? Why is it such a turnoff for so many people? Well, I think it comes down to two things. One, the feeling of the actual combat itself, and two, the core exploration. So let's dive in a little deeper. So the way this gameplay loop works is the player has the ability to play as both Red and Antea and can switch seamlessly between the two at nearly any given moment. Red is alive and is able to use his sword, torch, and rifle to attack the undead, and Antea is a ghost that has spectral abilities that give the player an edge in both combat and exploration. So for example, with the combat, there are certain ghosts that will have armor, and Antea is great to use to deplete their shield health, and then Red will come in afterwards to kill the enemy in its plain state. Antea is also heavily used for exploration and is used to blow up walls, reveal hidden weak points, and it just helps to reveal things that are unseen to Red's naked eye. And to be honest, it becomes pretty fun when the player finally has a good amount of these abilities to play with, but it just takes a while to get there, like I said. But what is really great about these combat systems is that Red and Antea's mechanics feed into one another, which incentivizes the player to use both parties to ensure maximum survival. Red is the only character who can actually die, so when switching to Antea, you are using her timer meter, and this will not affect Red's health meter at all, meaning that if you get hit by an enemy, it will just take a few seconds away from being able to play as Antea before switching back to Red. Also, the more that you fight with Red, the more of Antea's meter will fill up, creating a risk-reward system by being able to take down armored enemies and not losing any health in the process. Red's basic attacks are light and heavy attacks with his sword, as well as a banishing move that builds up over time by hitting enemies and can be kind of treated as like a special finisher move. He also has a rifle, which is kind of great since it has unlimited ammo, and even has a skill tree unlock that ties directly to your banishing meter, allowing for a 300% damage multiplier against any enemy type. Genuinely love this skill so much I abuse the absolute living shit out of it. Antea will gain a handful of abilities, which I won't spoil here, but the main two which are utilized throughout the game are a travel mechanic to hop across wide gaps, and an explosive ability which blows back enemies and opens up pathways to explore or push forward through the campaign. Some other basic mechanics that are commonplace for this style of game are dodging and diving, as well as parrying. I think ultimately the best comparison if we were to use a AAA title would be something like God of War 2018 or God of War Ragnarok. Now, don't get me wrong, God of War feels about 100 million times better to play, but the intuition you feel when playing Ghosts of New Eden will be due to that other third-person action game that you have played before. And I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is just the way it feels when you are hitting these enemies. It feels spongy, it feels weak, it doesn't have that impact that you feel when playing God of War or a Resident Evil or anything like that. And while that feeling never subsides, the more abilities you have to cover up the weakness of the feeling of the combat, it really helps put a band-aid over it so you're not thinking as much about how weak it feels, because the movesets and the actual engagement of the combat is pretty damn fun. The skill tree is also pretty underwhelming. While there is a good amount of new moves you can unlock, and I literally just said that they were fun, most of it is story gated, so by the time the end of the game comes around, you'll only have experienced all the great content for just a few short hours. So there are two types of skill points you can acquire. One is from leveling up your character through basic combat, and the other is through completing certain missions. These types of skill points are dumped into a mix of skills for both Antea and Red, and are surprisingly pretty effective. You can also swap skills around at any point in time, meaning that you don't have to stick to one build throughout the game, which is a nice quality of life feature since I'm probably never going to play this game more than once. But all in all, as I have mentioned already, the gameplay does in fact take a while to open up, but once you get the basics down and understand the fluidity of the movement between the two characters, there are moments that are quite fun and that have you excited and wanting much, much more. Okay, so now let's talk about point number 2, the game's exploration and the level design. As I noted before, the artistic vision of this game is up there with some of the best AAA titles that have debuted recently. And on a surface level, every biome or area that you are exploring looks like it could be filled to the brim with secrets and exploration. However, the level design tends to impede this aspect of the game, making what appears to be a semi-open world style game feel much more linear than the developers ever intended. All in all, this level design is akin to something like God of War, where certain areas are locked off due to certain character ability progression, which then encourages you to come back later to find more loot. The problem is, the loot really isn't that great, and a majority of items you need for crafting are found while you're just walking from point A to point B, or are dropped from boss fights and things like that. There are vendors located at various key areas on your map that will sell important loot as well, which can just be purchased outright. And although currency is hard to come by in Ghosts of New Eden, it's also tough to simply find great loot in random corners of the map. And the reason why I think the developers chose to make their game this way is primarily due to how the missions are structured. So how does it work? Well, each township or individual that you will come across has a dark encounter with the undead, and it's up to the player to put together the pieces in order to lay the soul to rest. Now, I kind of wish there was a bit more detective work inside of the gameplay, because it is a bit simple as you just walk up to the marker on your screen and then interact with it so you can push the story along. But throughout every case, generally the people involved are lying and deceiving you, so at the end it's up to the player to resolve things by either absolving the person of their crimes or straight up killing them and sucking their soul out of their body. It's actually fucking awesome. And what's great about this is it's all up to your discretion based on what you want to do regarding Antea's death from the beginning of the game. And so each of these missions are really interesting and entertaining as the tension builds up swiftly, leading to radical conclusions. But while the campaign and side content is rather compelling and executed quite well, when we think back to how these missions are structured, it makes sense why the developers chose to create their game as a semi-open world, as going on a hunt for clues requires much more freedom than a linear game design allows for. But when it comes to things like general exploration or traversing from area to area, things feel a bit more clunky and cumbersome than I would prefer. I want to circle back to combat real quick, but with the focus on enemies and the strange way that Don't Nod went about building them out. For starters, I don't think the enemy design is bad or anything like that, but it is a bit awkward at times. There are essentially a half dozen or so ghost enemy types. You have your basic grunt, the heavy, the ranged, etc., etc. All pretty run-of-the-mill type stuff, but there is a bit of a twist, and that is that every single ghost type can reincarnate a dead body, which then has them become even stronger. And once you kill that reincarnated body, the ghost will be booted out of it, and then you have to kill the ghost itself. So I give credit where credit is due. It's definitely creative, but overall I'm indifferent about it when it comes to the execution, because there are some instances where it feels very excessive, and since the combat isn't the strongest element of the game, it leads to being overwhelmed and ultimately your death. It would probably have been best to only allow certain enemies to do this. That way, when you see that particular enemy type, all your focus would be directed to it rather than on any enemy who can at any time turn into a more difficult version of itself. But I don't know, I have mixed feelings here, and I'm definitely curious about your feelings in the comment section. Where I think Ghosts of New Eden shines is with its boss fights. I have heard some murmurs that people aren't really enjoying these encounters at all and that they are way too easy, and I suppose there is some truth to that. But I highly disagree about them being bad, as they are fed into the storyline so well and are such a spectacle. I just couldn't turn my head and look away. But like I said, some criticism is correct, meaning that the combat aspect of these encounters isn't the end-all be-all. There aren't any Elden Ring moments that will crush you to the point of throwing your PC out the window, but it's that narrative and art design and that world building which carries these battles, and for what Don't Nod is going for here, it felt perfectly appropriate. But as I mentioned before, things take a while to get going from the purview of gameplay, and honestly, that can be quite a drag for some people. So if you're not enjoying yourself for the first few hours and then some, I don't blame you for not wanting to stick around for when the game eventually opens up, as that isn't your problem as the player. Before we wrap things up here, I would like to address the elephant in the room, because I know there are going to be a lot of people who complain that this game is woke trash and should be avoided at all costs. While I'm very interested in politics and culture, I do not claim nor do I want to be a political YouTube channel. I also don't like to call everything that is different to my ideology woke, because when you do that, that word becomes meaningless, similar to when people call their their opposition Nazis or any other trope that's typically abused. For example, in a recent review I did of Prince of Persia's The Lost Crown, people were calling that game woke simply because there was a black character inside of the game. That is obviously a preposterous thing, as adding a black person inside of media doesn't make something woke, as wokeness is simply about one thing: the subversion of truth. And while I don't plan on commenting on this stuff often in my videos, if it comes up in a video game, I think it's fair to discuss, especially since this game wears its ideological leanings right on its sleeve. It's no secret that most entertainment mediums are largely left-leaning, but when it comes to media taking place in different time periods, it can be quite frustrating because it ends up becoming entirely ahistorical and pulls you out of the immersive experience that the developers had initially created. And for those who say, well, it's just a work of fiction, the developers were just taking creative liberties here, that is an unfair characterization, because if it didn't matter, then why would the developers feel so inclined to focus on these minute details, painting certain groups of people in a misrepresenting way or a negative light? Think about the recent controversy with Google's AI tool, where they were recreating history just for the purpose of inclusivity. The perspective in which Don't Nod is attempting to tell this story is through something called standpoint theory. This theory, generally speaking, tells people to look at history through specific perspectives of oppressed groups and then interpret it through their eyes only. This in turn draws out vastly different conclusions as to what objectively happened in the past, leaving some people to then take it as historical fact, when really the truth has just become more murky due to the artist's ideological bent. And while this is largely a feminist theory, it can be applied to many other communities who perceive that they are marginalized. There are also many times throughout this game where the language and common tropes utilized in millennial progressive culture become injected into the writing, making things stated by the characters in the game to be anti-Christian, anti-male, and even anti-marriage. Listen, I wholly believe in artists being able to bring about their vision regardless of the harm it may impose, as my moral framework is based primarily on deontology. And so, as uncomfortable as this may be, part of my duties as a human being is to tell the truth, as I hope that the truth will outshine the darkness of lies, and the way that this game portrays certain actions and perspectives in history is just factually incorrect. So, if this will bother you, then I highly recommend skipping it. From where I stand, I know that this stuff is primarily nonsense and I can just roll my eyes and move past it, but it can be complicated, because where do we draw the line of what is acceptable and what's not? At the end of the day, Banishers: Ghosts of New Eden is a good game, but it's not a great game. It takes an incredibly long time to get moving, but once it does, the combat, the voice acting, and the storytelling are top-notch, particularly the narrative. If the gameplay and exploration is what's holding you back from purchasing this item, then I highly suggest waiting for a bit for a sale, or maybe Game Pass if it ever makes it over there. And if you're curious about another game that has recently been released, and if it's really as bad as people are letting on, then click right here to go and watch it.